In the heart of East Asia lies a land of profound contradictions. A nation of 26 million people, living under the shadow of a personality cult so immense it borders on the divine. This is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or DPRK. To the world, it is better known as North Korea. It is a place that projects an image of monolithic unity and military might, yet is plagued by chronic shortages of food and electricity. A country that has developed nuclear weapons and cyber warfare capabilities, while much of its population remains isolated from the global internet. To understand the North Korea of today, a nation seemingly frozen in a time warp of its own making, we must travel back. Back to a time before the rockets, before the nuclear tests, before the 3 generations of Kim dynasty rule. We must go back to the moment a single nation, with a shared history stretching for millennia, was cleaved in two by the iron blade of geopolitics. For 35 years, from 1910 to 1945, the Korean peninsula suffered under the brutal colonial rule of Imperial Japan. The Korean language was suppressed, names were forcibly changed to Japanese ones, and its people were mobilized to serve the Japanese war machine. But with Japan's defeat in World War II in August 1945, jubilation and hope for an independent future swept across the peninsula. This hope would be tragically short-lived. The victorious Allied powers, primarily the United States and the Soviet Union, had their own plans. In a decision made with little Korean consultation, they agreed to temporarily divide the peninsula for the purpose of disarming the Japanese forces. The dividing line was a hastily drawn latitude on a map, the 38th parallel. Soviet troops would occupy the north, American troops would occupy the south. What was intended as a temporary administrative measure quickly hardened into a rigid ideological frontier. The Cold War had begun, and Korea was its first great casualty. In the Soviet-controlled north, a new leader was being groomed. He was a 33-year-old former anti-Japanese guerrilla fighter named Kim Song-ju. The Soviets would give him a new name, one that resonated with legendary Korean resistance, Kim Il-sung. Backed by Soviet tanks and advisors, Kim Il-sung and his fellow communists swiftly consolidated power, eliminating rivals and implementing sweeping land reforms. They began to build a new state in their own image, a state that would become Kim's personal fiefdom. On September 9, 1948, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was officially proclaimed. The division was now formalized. The stage was set for catastrophe. From the moment of its creation, the DPRK, under Kim Il-sung, had one overarching, non-negotiable goal: the reunification of the Korean peninsula under communist rule. In the south, the American-backed, fiercely anti-communist Republic of Korea, led by Syngman Rhee, held the same ambition in reverse. Tensions along the 38th parallel were at a breaking point. At dawn on June 25, 1950, Kim Il-sung, having secured a green light from Joseph Stalin, launched a massive, surprise invasion across the border. The North Korean People's Army, well-equipped and well-trained, smashed through the unprepared South Korean defenses. Within 3 days, they had captured the southern capital, Seoul. It seemed Kim's dream of a swift victory was within his grasp. But the world reacted. The United States, under the banner of the United Nations, organized an international coalition to defend the South. In a daring amphibious assault at Incheon in September 1950, UN forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, cut the North Korean army in half and recaptured Seoul. The tide of the war had dramatically turned. UN forces pushed north, crossing the 38th parallel, capturing Pyongyang, and racing towards the Chinese border. Now it was China's turn to intervene. Chairman Mao Zedong, fearing an American presence on his border, sent hundreds of thousands of People's Volunteers surging into Korea. The unprepared UN forces were thrown into a brutal, bloody retreat. The war descended into a vicious stalemate, with front lines moving back and forth across the ravaged peninsula, inflicting unimaginable suffering on the civilian population. For 3 years, the Korean peninsula was plunged into a maelstrom of fire and steel. More bombs were dropped on North Korea than on the entire Pacific theater in World War II. Cities were flattened, reduced to landscapes of skeletal ruins. Millions of lives, soldiers and civilians alike, were lost. Finally, on July 27, 1953, an armistice was signed. Not a peace treaty, but a ceasefire. The fighting stopped, but the war never officially ended. The border was redrawn, roughly along the same pre-war line, but now fortified as the demilitarized zone, the most heavily armed border on Earth. Kim Il-sung had failed to unify Korea by force, and his country lay in absolute ruin. But in the ashes of this destruction, he began to forge a new ideology, a guiding principle that would define North Korea for the rest of its existence. He called it Juche. On the surface, Juche is an ideology of radical self-reliance. It preaches that the Korean people are the masters of their own destiny. Politically independent, economically self-sufficient, and militarily self-reliant. But in reality, Juche became the ultimate tool for totalitarian control. It justified cutting North Korea off from the world and demanded absolute, unquestioning loyalty not to the nation, but to one man, Kim Il-sung, now christened the Great Leader. With the war as a pretext, Kim Il-sung purged all his rivals, the pro-Soviet faction, the pro-Chinese faction, anyone who could possibly challenge him. He was building the world's first communist dynasty. A massive cult of personality was constructed. History was rewritten to portray him as a legendary warrior who single-handedly defeated the Japanese. He was no longer just a political leader, he was the son of the nation, the father of the people. His word was law, his image was sacred. The DPRK was being remade into Kim Il-sung's personal kingdom. For decades, North Korea's economy, rebuilt with massive aid from the Soviet Union and China, showed some initial signs of success, even outpacing the South for a time. But the rigid, centralized system of Juche was unsustainable. By the 1980s, the economy was stagnating. And then, the world changed. In 1991, the Soviet Union, North Korea's primary benefactor, collapsed. The flow of subsidized fuel, food, and technology abruptly stopped. It was an economic cataclysm. And just as this crisis hit, on July 8, 1994, Kim Il-sung, the man who had ruled as a god for nearly 50 years, died of a heart attack. The nation was plunged into a state of hysterical, orchestrated grief. The sun of the nation had set. Power passed to his son, Kim Jong-il, who had been groomed for succession for over 20 years. He was known as the Dear Leader. Where his father was a charismatic public figure, Kim Jong-il was reclusive, enigmatic, and known for his love of cinema and luxury goods. He inherited a nation on the brink of total collapse. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in Korean history, the Arduous March. A period of catastrophic famine in the mid to late 1990s. A combination of the loss of Soviet aid, decades of economic mismanagement, and a series of devastating floods and droughts caused the state's public distribution system, the lifeblood for millions, to completely collapse. The exact death toll is unknown, but estimates range from several 100,000 to over 2 million people. A generation was stunted by malnutrition. Stories of unimaginable desperation, of people eating grass and tree bark, emerged from the sealed-off nation. The Juche ideal of self-sufficiency had failed in the most horrific way possible. Faced with a starving population and a disintegrating state, Kim Jong-il announced a new policy, Sun Gun, or military first. The logic was brutal but simple. In a time of crisis, all of the country's scarce resources would be funneled to the Korean People's Army. The military would keep order at home and, more importantly, deter any foreign powers from taking advantage of North Korea's weakness. The military became the central pillar of the state. It was survival at all costs. And the ultimate guarantee of survival? A nuclear bomb. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, North Korea played a dangerous game of brinkmanship with the world. It would provoke a crisis with its developing nuclear and missile programs, then engage in negotiations to extract aid and concessions, only to renege on its promises later. In October 2006, the world's fears were realized. The DPRK conducted its first successful nuclear test, joining the exclusive club of nuclear-armed states. The dear leader had secured his ultimate deterrent. The Hermit Kingdom now had the bomb. In December 2011, like his father before him, Kim Jong-il died of a heart attack. The mantle of leadership now fell to his third and youngest son, Kim Jong-un. A man in his late 20s, educated in Switzerland, about whom the world knew almost nothing. Many analysts predicted he would be a weak figurehead, easily manipulated by the old guard, and that the regime would soon collapse. They were wrong. Kim Jong-un moved with astonishing speed and ruthlessness to consolidate his power. He purged and executed hundreds of officials, including his own powerful uncle, Jang Song-thaek, in 2013, accusing him of treason. He was signaling that his authority was absolute. He introduced a new state policy, Byungjin, or parallel development. This was a dual-track strategy, simultaneously pursuing economic development and the advancement of his nuclear arsenal. He wanted both guns and butter. For the first few years, the butter part was visible. New skyscrapers rose in Pyongyang, a ski resort was built, and a new class of moneyed elite, the Donju, became more prominent. But the guns part of the strategy would soon dominate the world's attention. Under Kim Jong-un, North Korea's weapons program accelerated at a terrifying pace. Between 2016 and 2017, he conducted dozens of missile tests and 2 more nuclear tests, including what was believed to be a hydrogen bomb. He demonstrated missiles capable of reaching the mainland United States. Tensions soared to their highest point in decades. The U.S. President, Donald Trump, and Kim Jong-un traded personal insults and threats of nuclear annihilation. The world held its breath. And then, in a stunning reversal, Kim Jong-un pivoted to diplomacy. In 2018, he met with South Korean President Moon Jae-in at the DMZ, becoming the first North Korean leader to step into the South. Weeks later, in an event that would have been unthinkable just months earlier, he met with a sitting U.S. president in Singapore. 2 more summits would follow. For a brief moment, it seemed like a breakthrough was possible. Declarations were signed, promises of denuclearization were made, and the language of war was replaced with the language of friendship. But the fundamental gap remained. The U.S. demanded complete, verifiable denuclearization before sanctions relief, while North Korea wanted a phased, step-by-step process. The 2019 Hanoi summit collapsed without a deal. The window of diplomacy slammed shut. The failure of diplomacy was followed by a global pandemic. North Korea sealed its borders more tightly than ever before, a self-imposed isolation that crippled its already fragile economy and worsened food security. Kim Jong-un admitted his economic plans had failed. But the Byungjin policy was not abandoned, it simply reverted to its primary focus. The country has since unveiled a terrifying new array of weaponry, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, hypersonic glide vehicles, and military spy satellites. As we stand here in mid-2025, the DPRK is more isolated from the West, yet more belligerent, than ever. The brief charm offensive of 2018 is a distant memory. The hope for peaceful reunification has been officially abandoned, with Kim Jong-un declaring South Korea a hostile state and an invariable principal enemy. The monuments to reunification have been torn down. In the new geopolitical landscape forged by the war in Ukraine, Pyongyang has found a new, old partner. It has deepened its military and economic ties with Russia, allegedly supplying Moscow with artillery shells and missiles in exchange for food, fuel, and advanced military technology. The old Cold War axis is re-emerging. And what of the 26 million people at the heart of this story? For them, life remains a daily struggle for survival under a system of total control. They are subject to pervasive surveillance, with no access to free information and no political freedom. And yet, cracks of change have appeared. Illicit markets, called Jangmadang, born from the famine of the 90s, now account for a huge portion of the economy, creating a grassroots capitalism the state can't fully control. Smuggled USB drives and SD cards carrying South Korean dramas and foreign news offer glimpses of an outside world, slowly eroding the state's monopoly on information. The story of North Korea is a story of a nation born from the tragedy of division, forged in the crucible of a devastating war, and sustained by an ideology of absolute control and paranoid self-reliance. It is a dynasty that has defied all predictions of its demise, surviving famine, the collapse of its patrons, and crippling international sanctions. For over 3/4 of a century, the Kim regime has held on to power by creating a permanent state of crisis, pointing to an ever-present external enemy to justify internal sacrifice. The future remains profoundly uncertain. Will the regime's internal contradictions lead to collapse? Will the information smuggled from the outside world spark a change from within? Or will the Iron Kingdom endure, passing power to a fourth generation, its nuclear arsenal the ultimate guarantor of its continued existence? The one certainty is that the fate of millions of Korean people, on both sides of the DMZ, hangs in the balance, still living with the consequences of a line drawn on a map some 80 years ago.